it was a creepy, stormy day. When we see space, we got all the times left. When we see at night, never, never ends in time.
Welcome to Artificial. I am Julian Harper, the host here, and I am accompanied by my fellow hosts and co-workers.
Hey, I'm Maggie.
I am Alasia. I'm really excited to be here today. It's been a minute since I've been on the podcast, so super hyped.
Hello, I'm Alex, and yeah, I am also super excited to be here on the podcast.
We're here today to talk a little bit about self-realization, or I think probably more commonly people say self-diagnosis, and what is it, why is it important, and kind of how it relates to some of the stuff that we do here at Artreach, and why it's like blowing up, I think, in terms of like relevance for individuals with disabilities and just individuals in general. And to maybe start off, a lot of kind of the impetus was a book that a lot of people have read. It's called Unmasking Autism. It's by Dr. Devin Price, that goes into a really interesting discussion about diagnosis and what it is and what it isn't, and how diagnosis might not necessarily be a way of you getting access to the things that you need. Self-realization or self-discovery in terms of an identity like autism, or like a reality of thinking and being, could be helpful outside of the frame of medical diagnosis. But like, how does that work, and what does that mean? And so I think that was an interesting starting point as it relates to some of our programs and why we don't rely on diagnosis as a parameter in the stuff that we do. So with that being said, what is it, and why are people engaged with it? Like, give a little bit of background here. In my understanding of self-realization, I kind of like to think of all diagnosis kind of starts at the point of like you put together ideas of symptoms and things that are happening, and then you bring them to someone. That's, to me, diagnosis always starts with self-realization or self-diagnosis. And that a lot of like the current discussion and wave around self-diagnosis is around, one, questioning the framework by which traditional diagnosis happens, whether that be like the DSM and the history of like psychiatric care and the violences that have happened, and the way that they also hold their own biases in like the way that, like, for instance, particular like autism, how it's been studied specifically in boys. So the diagnostic criteria emphasizes stuff that is like, it's literally built to diagnose little white boys. So I think self-diagnosis is about like one, a critique of how contemporary diagnosis happens, and two, also a realization of like how diagnosis functions, maybe both as like a point of potential access, but also as a point of regulation and of determining who is a part of a population that gets certain rights and who doesn't. For instance, like people with like a formal autism diagnosis can't emigrate to certain countries. Fun fact.
Fun.
And so the the book Unmasking Autism is talking a lot about those sort of like institutional and those sorts of larger reasons why someone might or might not want to like approach diagnosis. So yeah, those are some first thoughts about it. I'm interested to hear, you know, other people and how they've kind of like come to it and thought about it.
Yeah, this is Alex. I guess I forgot to mention this in my intro as well. I'm also self-realized, self-diagnosed neurodivergent myself, which is something that I sort of came to realize really just a few years ago, but also mostly through the work that we do at Outreach. Being around other people who do have official diagnoses as neurodivergent, other people who are self-realized, it really became like obvious at a certain point, like, oh, I'm like this too. But yeah, in the book Unmasking Autism, it also just points out so many helpful things about exactly like you said, Julian, like how the DSM-5 is still the diagnostic criteria that is used. And like, so today, women or people assigned female at birth, people who are not white men, straight white men, are so less likely to receive a diagnosis because they don't fit into that very stereotypical, like, 7-year-old boy that you were talking about. So I think, like, especially in the age of TikTok and stuff, people have been sharing their own neurodivergent traits, and I feel like that's been really helpful for people to kind of feel more comfortable self-diagnosing or self-realizing themselves. So that was definitely helpful in my own little journey.
Yeah, this is Alasia. I would like to echo what Alex is saying about, having that self-realization moment, having those moments through the work that we do, through social media. I myself do identify as neurodivergent and haven't had a formal diagnosis. However, something that has been affirming as of late, and I've had to stop myself and be like, why is this so affirming? But recently my therapist bringing up a potential neurodivergent diagnosis and saying, you have a lot of traits, and like the way you speak and the things that you're saying, the way that you navigate your life makes me think that you may be neurodivergent. And it's not something I had brought up to her before. So it was very affirming to be like, okay, yes, like a medical professional is backing up something that I've thought about myself. But then at the same time, I think it's really hard to not feel so affirmed when you are faced with a medical professional being like, no, you're right. Like, the things that you have been feeling and thinking about yourself are true, and to have somebody who has that authority to say that it's true, like, unfortunately, is still, like, more validating than I want to admit that it is. But I think that, as Alex said, there is a lot to be said about the emergence of people sharing their symptoms on TikTok. And for me, if you're not on TikTok, seeing them on Instagram Reels. But I'm also very interested in the various stigmas around self-diagnosis, self-realization, in addition to the stigma of having a diagnosis, because that exists as well. So it's really interesting, where it almost feels like it's almost like a situation where no matter what you do, it's like there is some kind of stigma, whether it's because you do have a formal diagnosis or whether you don't have a formal diagnosis. But yeah, that's what's been on my mind. That's what I'm thinking about, especially as like we talk about the medical model in relation to self-realization, self-diagnosis, because it does depend on things that exist within the medical model having a psychiatrist be like the final lawmaker of what's going on inside of you. And I'm wondering, when we talk about the social model, then how does that stigma come into play in the social model versus in the medical model? Because I think it exists in various models, and it's weird to want to find community on the basis of something that for so long has had to be an official documentation that is given to you by your doctor.
I feel like there's like the pressure that people feel that imagines that the accommodations, that the help, that the resources available to people are always scarce.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like that is at the heart of like a particular kind of anxiety that's like, oh, you are claiming this thing and you haven't gone through the long, expensive, arduous, humiliating process of going through multiple appointments for someone to write on a piece of paper so that I can get access to this thing that I need. You are not this thing, because I worked really hard to get someone to write this down and to make that available to me. And that's hard because, you have empathy for that, because it's like, but it's almost like a larger, and you brought up the medical model. There's like a larger system that believes in individuals, that they're the point of like solving the issue, which is also at like the locus of the problem. Self-diagnosis or self-realization is also like a way of acknowledging a lot of breaks in that system, that acknowledging like a lack of access as maybe the first point and barrier, like especially financially. Like I think in the Unmasking Autism book, it talked about like the number of visits that families with Black children that they want to get diagnosed, and how many more visits it takes to get a diagnosis. And so there's these like administrative things. I also think that like there's something interesting about like how the medical model is so easy to turn into policy. And it's a philosophy that imagines that care is something like oil that can be extracted and that can be exhausted, and then that it can also be valued at a specific price, and instead of the truth, in which it is a commodity that can go up forever because people need it to live. But I also feel like maybe on the flip side, there is a space where people don't necessarily take the time to understand people with higher, maybe more expensive needs, maybe more community needs, and that like the language around that might, where people who in fact maybe do need more resources feel a little bit alienated by people who are taking up a lot of time and energy in a space that someone else has spent a lot of other extra time and energy in, and that like that's also really tough and really hard. I feel like that's a pretty good background as to why self-diagnosis is becoming very popular.
Yeah, and it's frustrating too, because you mentioned how medical model is found so much in like policies about requiring documentation for someone to prove their disability in order to receive an accommodation. And it's really funny because a lot of the ADA, or the part of the ADA that we focus on the most often, which is like places of public accommodation services, the ADA goes so far to like really hit home the point that people don't have to prove their disability to you if they're requesting those types of services from places that aren't places of public accommodation. But then when we go and look at employment under the ADA, then it's suddenly okay to request documentation, to get an accommodation at work. And so I feel like most of the time when people are looking for an official diagnosis, it's because they do need an accommodation at their job, and then the law tells them that it's okay for employers to ask for that. But it is kind of frustrating too, because you also mentioned, Julian, how expensive the diagnostic process can be. And I know, at least when it comes to receiving an autism diagnosis, I know that for most people, I think even regardless of whether or not you have insurance, like there's very long waiting lists to even get an appointment for that type of diagnosis. It's such a long process, and then on top of that, it can cost upwards of like thousands of dollars just to get that piece of paper that says that you are diagnosed with autism. So like the entire process of receiving that medical diagnosis in itself becomes a barrier for people that only need it to break down a barrier at work, or, you know, at the hospital, or, you know, whatever they need it for. But yeah, so it's just really, it's always been very frustrating to me, that weird dichotomy, like within the law itself, that is dictating when it's okay versus when it's not okay to ask for someone for proof.
It's funny too that, like, for critics of self-realization, the processes that would make it less prevalent are simplifying and easing the process of diagnosis, biocertification, like this process of having to prove yourself through these like medical like processes. You know, we work within the arts, and so we're not necessarily like engaged with that so directly, but from, especially you guys have talked about speaking to front of house staff, and you see the process of biocertification all the time. When someone says, you don't look disabled to me, so I will not give you access to this program that you have, like, you are allowed to have access to. That is a process of biocertification in, like, I don't know, the most perverse sense.
Yeah, we see that all the time in art spaces that we work in, like you said, like with front of house staff, where, I mean, it always, I feel like no matter what conversation we might be having on the podcast, it always comes back to training and just like education for people. But it's really, you know, people haven't received training, they don't know any better, and then they're falling back on their own internal biases to decide for themselves whether or not someone, or decide for themselves what a person is or is not capable of, without, you know, there just isn't a lot of trust in people with disabilities to know what is best for them, which is something that we just unfortunately see so often. So that leads to situations where only people that have visible physical disabilities are being offered to use the elevator, and people who quote unquote don't look disabled are turned away from being able to use, you know, the elevator or the accessible restroom. I feel like we've mentioned Nay quite a few. Our coworker Nay, who uses a service animal, I feel like they come up on the podcast a lot as well. But I was traveling with them at a conference last week, and almost every single place we went, a person at the restaurant, a person at the train station was, you know, telling them what they can and can't do with their service animal, when in fact they know themselves best, they know their service animal best. And they shouldn't have to prove that or justify that to someone who has never met them before. So yeah, that definitely comes back to, you know, at the heart of what we do. We try to remove that forced disclosure and try to, you know, educate the arts organizations that we're partnering with that is a constant thing that people with disabilities are facing everywhere they go on a daily basis. So why not do what we can to remove that for them?
Totally. Yeah, and I think you pointed at something that is also maybe a large part of why self-realization would be a thing, and that's expertise. You brought up Nate.
Mm-hmm.
Nate knows service animals and the law around service animals very, very well. Much better than anyone who's ever coming up to them. More importantly, they understand their own disability and conditions and experience. In the book, it talks about self-realization, especially in terms of mental health diagnoses, because of its very, very particular lineage, especially in its political and economic history. Is very interesting learning about, and this is another book, Decarcerating Disability, which talks about a very similar lineage between prisons and institutions, and the psychiatric world and industry was a huge part of that, and that the poorhouse was not just a kind of synonym for prison. It was where they put individuals with disabilities and the poor together in a place. And I think in the Unmasking Autism book, I think early on it talks about diagnosis as a tool of political control, how political distance are given certain diagnoses. Even now, we're still in a place where we're seeing the moral model attached also to the medical model, especially in age of anti-trans and that world where queer individuals were diagnosed to the DSM, and that has been subtly transitioning from queerness itself to gender dysphoria. But even then, it's a messy history. I feel like in a lot of the spaces we're talking a lot about medical or social model of disability, but I think in a lot of ways we aren't necessarily talking about how it actually functions politically, and that is as a way of deciphering who is allowed to work and engage in the political economy, and so it often isn't as easy as saying that one should be proud of X when someone knows or has had an experience of diagnosis as a way of saying you can't work, or as a way of proving something about them, that they are lazy or that they are incapable of something. I think the larger hope is that self-diagnosis or self-realization is a way of imagining the locus of expertise in the person, regardless, that their experience and body is unique to them, which should give them expertise over their bodies.
Yeah, there's so many things too. Something you just said just sparked another thought. In terms of when it comes to providing diagnoses or providing an official diagnosis to the government for whatever reason. A lot of people need to do that in order to receive Social Security benefits. But then if they are doing that, that comes with so many other prejudices. Like people with disabilities who receive Social Security literally can't get married, or they will lose their Social Security benefits. They also can't have, I think the most money that they're allowed to have in all of their assets is $10,000 in savings. They're not allowed to have any more than that. But it's so it's this weird thing where they need those Social Security benefits and they need the diagnosis in order to get those benefits, but then having the benefits in the first place creates all of these other burdens on the person. So that makes me angry.
Yeah.
Totally. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it's truly forced poverty. I think that might also be part of the frustration, maybe, that individuals feel who have gone through that process, who are doing their best to maintain their SSI or SSDI benefits, and are I have to prove this amount of work, but I also know that I can't go above these particular assets, and I have to always kind of be vigilant because I am always these benefits are also always under attack, and that I'm always used as a political tool to visualize a metaphor for waste.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I'm thinking of it as like in layman's terms, it's like you gotta pay your dues. You gotta pay your dues if you want a diagnosis. You have to go through all of the BS, censored, to get that diagnosis, to eventually get those benefits or that accommodation. And if you do self-diagnose, if you do engage with self-realization, then the way to prove that like that you really have it, that you're serious about it, is like if you put in the work to go after that diagnosis. Like that seems to be the vibe, so to say. But yeah, like all of this is, I feel like it's just coming back to like, okay, time to pay your dues and prove that like you are deserving of XYZ. And then, as you said, even when you get XYZ, it could be bad to get XYZ because you have all these restrictions put on your life legally, or that are like financially binding. And so it seems like a lot of work to get a diagnosis that could still further complicate your life. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So in some ways it's like, yay, I got the diagnosis. In other ways it's like, oh great, now that I have this diagnosis, like I have to deal with all of these other barriers. And I'm just creating more work for myself to like continuously prove that I really need these accommodations, which, as I'm sure y'all know, for people who are neurodivergent, or at least in my experience, that is so difficult. That I'm like, it's like, it's almost like tailored to make the exact kind of person who needs this diagnosis or needs these accommodations to jump through hoops that are specifically made to be difficult for the way that they navigate the world or their brain works.
Are you saying that they make it difficult
like
for people to access the
No.
benefits that they need, possibly intentionally?
There's Julian, no, because they care about us. Come on.
Surely.
They care. They put the care in healthcare. No.
They've got all the flags they love. Yeah.
It's such a funny little system that like, it's like any other system that exists in this country where we're like, the system is working. Like the system is working, and are the masses like learning about self-realization from TikTok? Like, is that rebelling? And I feel like that's like full circle to like where we kind of started, where it's like, is self-realization, is self-diagnosis like the defense against this very formal world of diagnosis? I don't know if like necessarily the people who are engaging with it on TikTok, like especially younger folks, if it's like coming from a place of like, let's rebel against the medical model, let's rebel against the difficulties, or if it's like coming from, I see it as coming from like an even more human, tender place of like, oh, finding community. I found something that clicks and something that makes sense to me. And so even if I don't take what I've gotten from TikTok and go to a doctor and like get that diagnosis, like who even cares? Like maybe part of it is just about finding that community and like sometimes getting those trickle down, trickle down like coping mechanisms, trickle down information that like, you're like, regardless of whether or not this was created quote unquote for me based on whether or not I have this diagnosis, it still helps. Like, I color code my calendar, like my personal calendar, using the red light, green light, yellow light system, because that is helpful for me to keep track of like, okay, I have a lot of high energy things that are maybe anxiety inducing or cause me stress in some way. And then I have, I try to put in a lot more green things that are like restorative or recharging. And then like my yellows are neutral. But like visually balancing my calendar is something that I found on like, I don't know, a site that was talking about neurodivergence and autism and ADHD, and I'm just like reading these sources in hopes that I'm like, let me try out some of these things and maybe they'll work. So like I feel like there are so many different reasons that one might seek self-diagnosis or might engage with self-realization, whether it is the baseline of like, I just want to understand like what's going on in my head a little bit better, and I find comfort in reading Reddit posts and seeing TikToks from people who are similarly navigating the world the way that I am, and they're able to share information that has helped them, and maybe that helps me. And like then there's like, okay, am I going to take that now and go to this authority figure in psych land, who maybe if I need it can then give me access to medication that I need. So that like, that's like the next like step that I see where I'm like, okay, like maybe it gets to the point where you're like, I do want this, or I'm interested in seeking out this kind of, access, service, medication, tool, whatever, that can only be granted by the powers that be, because they have the special piece of paper that says they went to school, that says that they have the authority to give you drugs. So I'm like, there are some ways where I'm like, yeah, like sometimes it's like, okay, I got to bring this up to, these formal institutions that you go into it, or at least I go into it, and I'm like, oh, now I have to like, I'm Black, I am a woman, like there's all these other things, that we talked about before. But yeah, I feel like there's such a range, there's a spectrum when it comes to self-realization and what one hopes to get out of that. And like for me, when it has just been like looking for coping mechanisms or tools that I can use, or just finding community and being like, okay, I'm not alone in this, and like, oh good, other people struggle with these same things and like have to do these specific weird little things to like get themselves through the day as well. Like, great, awesome. And it almost feels like with self-diagnosis, there is a cap before you get into that space where it's like, there's like comfort, and then there's like the difficulty that comes after, and then you might get back into comfort.
Yeah, you said something a few moments ago too, that like, so mostly so far we've just talked about people who are seeking seeking formal diagnosis because they need it for something, because they need to prove it to someone else, like Alasia just said. But we haven't talked yet about really the people that are seeking diagnosis because they need to prove it to themselves.
Yes, like what if it's for me?
Yeah, like that, and that's something too that I think like when it comes to self-realization, I feel like this is maybe mentioned in Unmasking Autism too. Like the imposter syndrome is so real when it comes with that too, because I know I went through it. I still experience it. I'm like, wait, am I? Wait, I don't know. Because we've been taught by society that like, oh, if we don't fit that stereotypical criteria, we're taught to question whether or not we're right. And so you have all these people who feel that they might be neurodivergent, who can't even trust themselves to know if that's actually true. So then they kind of, like you said in the beginning too, Alasia, it was actually affirming to hear that from your therapist, like, that sucks that you know, that I mean, it's great to get that affirmation, but there are so many people that feel that they have to be validated by a medical professional in order to be themselves, I guess.
Exactly. Yeah, I also, something that you said earlier too, Alasia, about it being like, or feeling a little bit at this moment like it's like very generation to generation, like what the attitude is. That's definitely like something that also doesn't stop at like self-realization for neurodivergence. I've experienced that like in the medical sense, is insofar as being assigned female at birth and having a chronic headache disorder, like my first neurologist was like, hey diva, girls just get headaches sometimes, take some Excedrin. And then 3 months later I came back and was like, I'm still having debilitating like 2-week-long migraines, queen. Can I get a little more help? And even then, like, I feel like you know, like, as I was like starting to then realize like, oh, okay, so this is going to be like mostly me self-managing, finding resources and community online, but even talking with folks across generations in my own life, like, you know, like there are folks in my family who were like, oh, well, like, don't go like down a thought spiral about like what might be happening, because like, you know, even though this is like a brand new thing onsetting for you at a very particular time, like it might just be like stress. And like, in fact, reader, listener, it's, you know, 2 years later, it's not. I've had many scans of my brain. There's stuff going on in there. You know what I mean? Like, it's very, like, and even, like, I don't know. I feel like it took me a really long time in trying to, like, navigate the system. And also, like, it took me so long to break up with my first neurologist because I was like, oh, well, like, I am just a girl, you know, like, I am, you know, like, I might just true. Be, you know what I mean? But, like, that, the, like, you literally just said it and I can't pull the phrase. So I'm looking into Alex's eyes saying,
syndrome.
Thank you.
Oh, yes, that's the one. That's
the imposter syndrome of it all. Like, even though, like, you know, it's something that I've been experiencing for years now, you know, like, it's very, very interesting. So this is, again, pop psychology book that I bought for $5 the last time I was in New York City, but the title looked interesting. As a person who identifies as like introverted, like, dare I say, kind of shy until you get to know me. Like, I prefer to walk through a place I don't know and not be perceived at all. I picked up a book called Talking to Strangers, What We Should Know About the People We Don't Know. It's by Malcolm Gladwell. He used to be a columnist, I think, for the New York Times.
I think the New Yorker.
The New Yorker, thank you. One of those. And it's basically a book about truth default theory, which is a theory that was, I have the Wikipedia, some guy named Timothy Levine, who is a chair of communication studies at the University of Alabama. He's also had research funded by the FBI, unfortunately. But a lot of this theory basically is like something that Timothy Levine primarily has used in work around policing and interrogation. And it's his thought that, like, okay, so humans as a society default to truth for many reasons. Like, you know, someone comes up to you on the street and they say, oh, I need to get to like 14th and Chestnut. How do I get there? And you say, take 2 lefts and a right. You're going to, you know, take that at face value, believe them, and hope you get there. Yeah. But because Timothy Levine was interested in researching about like moments, like why people lie, why people are being deceptive, particularly obviously in like a crime scene sense, you know, it's that like generally as a society we default to truth because it's also about like it's better, it's quote unquote better for society if we all believe the truth from each other all the time. And if we were all constantly looking at each other and like second guessing and being like, like, are you sure that that's how I get to 14th and Chestnut? Then, you know, things would crumble. We wouldn't function very well. And so as we've been talking about like moments when you've been like at a site and have had people be like, oh, like, are you really disabled enough to need that accommodation? Or like, oh, like, is that service animal really allowed to be in here? You know, like, I've been thinking a lot about the idea of like, well, if truth default theory is like the thing, what if it's not actually? You know, like clearly it's not, especially the disability community.
It's not for some people.
It's not for many people.
Yeah. It's like you are not trusted. As I think Alex, you had said that before. Like, I mean, it is so front
And
like,
especially
that happens in museums. Like people just do not trust
Yeah.
when somebody's like, I have a disability.
And especially like in the medical model, I know Julian, you and I have had many conversations about like, you know, like the patient is something to be worked around.
Yeah.
The patient is not a collaborator in their own care. I'm literally using your words there. Like that patient is like, you know, like when I go to the doctor and I say, I've had a migraine for 2 weeks, they say, oh, have you really? Like, actually have you? Like, how bad is your pain? Can you rate it on a scale of 1 to 10?
Tests.
Let's do some tests. Like, and even when the tests are done and they're looking at it, they're like, Holly, you're so young. You know? Like, and it's like, well, I don't, you know,
Well, you
But
have to be 35 to tell the truth.
How could it happen if you're young, even though you have all the symptoms for it? But,
well,
like, how could it
yeah,
happen,
no,
though?
for real, exactly.
Yeah.
And so,
Yeah.
yeah. And also, like, you know, it's like, I don't know, but it kind of also ties back into something that we were talking about earlier, in that, like, diagnosis in that way can very much be tied to real administrative social violence. And I don't know. Also, again, like, this is not the book. I'm gonna be so real. The book actually isn't that great. Like, the book uses, it lays out the idea of like what truth default theory is, and like, you know, then the rest of the book is basically just like going through different scenarios and case studies, particularly of like, you know, like they talk about the Sandra Bland case, and they talk about like the Brock Turner case, and like there was like some big scandal in the 90s where like some CIA operative was like actually a Cuban spy or something, and like had been for years. Like,
Yeah.
we were talking about.
No, I've read this book. You know, I'm just.
Oh, T.
No.
Well, then why don't you talk about it? You're better at
No,
talking about books.
No, I think
you did a great
I
job,
think you're
Maggie.
speaking about it
Thank
really
you.
well. I mean,
thank you.
it also talked about I think they talked about Bernie Madoff too.
Yes,
right?
they sure did.
Yeah, it talks. Yeah, I think one of the cases they make that's like, oh, like these scammers or these things that happen, like they're not geniuses. We just assume that they're telling the truth, which is interesting.
Yeah.
You know, there could be larger things like how our criminal system is not good at solving cases and crimes.
Because that's not what it's about.
Yeah, like I do, like I think I'm with you though, like because what you're saying is that like this is an interesting theory, but it kind of brings up like the way in which we in fact treat disability oppositely because of the way that our medical system is set up, where it's all about proving yourself. It's all about a kind of and we've talked about like just like how your doctor is maybe closer to like a priest than like anything. That like you are like showing your sins, like what did you eat, how much do you exercise,
do you drink coffee,
are you how closely are you doing your regimen, your pills, how often are you seeing someone, are you seeing this person, are you getting this referral for this person, are you doing all those things? And I think how it relates to our conversation is that like you know a lot of this originate in like the mental health and psychiatric space, but I think the larger thing is that we're talking like, I think a lot of self-realization comes from this understanding that the amount of people who fit into the model of the healthy person is so small. And that it isn't just like this idea of like the healthy body is truly mythological. And that if you go through the DSM, like seeing all the ways in one could quote deviate from the perfect body it's astronomical, and one would be hard pressed not to diagnose oneself if one went through the entire DSM, which calls into question like what this process does and who it's for and how it functions, and that like even like you're saying in the medical space, there's not like there is still this dynamic where your doctor isn't just engaging with like the objectivity of science, it's also engaging with the kind of like moral and policy understanding, like even really recently there conversation, I have a kidney disease, and the way in which your like stage of like kidney disease was rated would be different depending on your race. There is race science that exists within diagnosis all the time, and so like I think a lot of self-realization is about like, oh, this mythological healthy body, I can't keep up with it. And that, like you were saying, that there's all of these tools that, and things that one might not understand, like in the medical space, as like accommodation, because maybe they can't be quantified and sold so easily, but they are maybe life-changing in the way that they provide a more comfortable and livable life. And I think that is like a lot of it too, is that just like that I feel like there are a lot of people who are in between like, you know, there's some people who like the working through the benefits of the government is so crucial that they don't have the privilege or the option to forego that. And that isn't, you know, antagonistic to people who are who recognize that they are thinking different and feeling differently, and they feel like they found a group of people that think and feel similarly, and ways in which they've made their lives better, and the people who imagine themselves outside of that space, in a non-disabled space. And I feel like I think there's just a larger and larger amount of people in between there, and I feel like that's like where a lot of this growth in self-diagnosis. I do feel like there is maybe a little bit of legitimate anxiety with TikTok.
No, for real, for real.
And like, and the way that I think the real worrying thing is the way that normal things become pathologized.
Yes.
And that like rather than it working only in one way, where the things that are different come together and you find community and you find ways to make your life better, like the things that are completely normal and banal and mundane are being turned into are being transferred into pathologies, which is,
have you checked on your microbiome in your gut lately?
Is like so terrifying and like and so funny, and I think that's where a lot of anxiety comes from like, you know, people in the professional space and like where they're like there's so much misinformation that we have to like work through.
It's like
and
comparing to like there are so many people that have quote unquote emotional support animals that believe themselves that this is a service animal, and like when in fact when they try to bring their animal places, it's just harming the people that actually do have legitimate service animals. So like I feel like kind of in the same vein, like there's people that are maybe like, you know, are not actually neurodivergent who are convincing themselves that they are, and because of one little video that they saw on TikTok.
I feel like that too, like they're engaging with this language and feeling like, oh, like I can take claim of this. So now I'm going to talk in the language of like discrimination. This is discrimination. I'm going to go to this place, not understanding that discrimination is a legal apparatus, and you have to understand which is its own beast and animal. And so that is an interesting, maybe a full circle part of like the, like, I don't think, we do not personally believe in overutilization as a problem. We don't believe that people are overutilizing services, health, arts, otherwise. And we want our definition and knowledge of disability to be as wide as physically possible. But it is hard when there's a lot of, when the information that is really easily available might not lead people to access that they need, and that like it that can be kind of hard and difficult to be like, hey, it sounds like that this really appeals to you and that you want to be a part of this space and community. This is not how you're going to get access to that thing. That's okay. But like being a part of any community is not necessarily about like being the loudest. So I think maybe there's a little bit too of like learning and coming together, and because I think a lot of it too is that like, you know, those spaces are not, as much as it feels like you're going back and forth between people, you know, you're not, you know, and that's really tough too. But I think I definitely, one of my least favorite phrases or words is overutilized. And because
Say it again.
it's its own philosophy that has,
especially in the art space.
Yeah.
Sorry, don't.
No. Oh, all I was gonna say, it's a philosophy that has fundamentally ruined American healthcare forever.
So real.
Yes.
so real. And like when it comes to the work that we do, like, I don't know, like there have been times where there has been like, you know, concerns about like a program being like taken advantage of or like quote unquote overutilized. And it's just kind of like, I'm truly just at a loss at that point. Like, I don't know, like, what do you, it's, you know, like, especially like in art spaces, it's like, we're gonna really like I'm trying to be very, you know.
And like, there's no happy medium, because it's like when we go to arts organizations, the first thing they're usually frustrated about is that their access programs are being underutilized, that no one's coming. And then ultimately the decision is like, well, no one's coming, so we're just never going to do it again, which is obviously not the solution.
Yeah, they're so funny. They're like, why doesn't the disability community that we've never tried to earn the trust of want to come to our programs? And then it's like, you know what? Screw them. They don't deserve programs anymore because they didn't show up to the first
worst
ones.
possible way.
Yes. And I'm like, what? Guys, come on.
Yeah. Or like we at Outreach, we have a program that offers people with disabilities and people who have low income and receive state benefits to access cultural sites at a very deeply discounted cost. And some, you know, Alasia and I face organizations that have anxieties about like too many people coming at a low cost, which is like, wow.
They're like, we can't have all of these disabled people who would benefit from the removal of this financial barrier come enjoy the arts. Like we it's just too many of them. To which I so eloquently say, guys, it's not that deep. Just it's not that deep. I know that it's deep for you, maybe because capitalism, blah blah blah, your bottom line, blah blah blah.
But it's also
it's
like
not that deep.
And it's like how deep that exclusion goes, because then it's like, oh, like what's the first step? It's like, oh, we're not going to have any information about it on our website. You have to call us. You can't just like, you know,
It's a
even get your,
secret.
you can't get your ticket in the way that anybody else can. Then when you do call, you have to like, you know, like, I don't know.
Yeah,
It's
and
like
you
a
can't
whole-
just show up because,
No.
again, you have to
plan in
force
advance.
your disclosure. You have to disclose in order
Yeah.
to get anything.
And then, God forbid, you don't look disabled enough, because this is something that Alex and I have to deal with sometimes when talking to partners. And they're like, but what if this person looks so able-bodied, and like, what then? And we're like, what do you mean what then? Like,
It's
give
like,
them their
how about-
ticket. What do you mean what
yeah,
then?
it's none of your business, actually.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm like, stop being so
It's like-
nosy.
Yeah. I was about to be kind of rude.
No, I mean,
Be rude.
Don't edit it out. You can
I
edit
was
it out.
like, is your badge say like you know, it's funny in an episode we're talking about like self-diagnosis to be like, are you a doctor? But
Right.
but,
Literally like, oh, would you like to look at
but
my,
but it is definitely like your job isn't to do that, right? Like your job is to like sit here and admit people into the facility.
And well, as somebody whose job it was to do that, it turns out it is your job to say, hey, I noticed you have a dry, closed umbrella. You are not allowed to have that here, even though it's being used as a cane, clearly. It means having to, real example, go and be like, hi, sir, we're being watched on the cameras right now. But I am supposed to ask you or to tell you that you can't have your umbrella. However, I see that you might be using it as, you know, something you need
A
to
mobility
use. It's
device.
literally a mobility. Like,
Yeah.
you might be
And,
using it in this way. To which
Yeah.
he's like, I am. Thank you for getting that. Please, can I keep my umbrella? To then have to tell management, like, hey, I'm going to let this man keep his umbrella, which is clearly being used as a mobility device. He's using it as a cane. Like, he's not going to go and hit all of the Picassos out of anger or something. But like, and then at the end of the day, I'm like, it's not my job to tell somebody that they can't use something that,
Yeah.
like, and I think part of it is the legitimacy of like
It's
using
giving
something
cop.
else that
I'm gonna
isn't
be
a
so
cane
real.
as a cane.
It's really
Yeah.
giving cop.
Yeah.
Like,
No,
And-
and
and
exactly.
no-
I'm like, why am I policing? Don't make me police. Don't make me go after. Like, when I am on the job being told in my little radio, hey, I see somebody who, like, it looks like they're breaking a rule. And that rule is that they have a mobility device.
Yeah.
Or something that, like, you might not see as being a legitimate enough mobility device, but still is. That I'm like, what are we doing here, guys? What are
Yeah.
this is a cultural site. We're meant to look at the art and allow people to look at the art, hopefully without hassle.
Like, oh, the person is looking too close to the wall text that is like 9-point font.
Yeah, I'm like, sorry that it's
guys.
hard to read. I'm sorry that somebody might have low vision and it's like literally difficult
Yeah.
to read the text that you chose to put there and made it
Yeah.
tiny.
I think like, you know, we're getting into like the the more subtle ways that policy becomes discriminatory or discrimination becomes policy.
Yeah.
And that, like, you know, some of that coming from like wanting to create or preserve a culture, and that that subtly dictates how and who gets to see and look at something, like from like the infrastructure to, like, you know, you're talking about the apparatus of, like, you know, you're getting checked in, like, you know, so many places, like, okay, you got to pass through your security gate or your security guard or, you know, your front desk person or you know, your gallery attendant / security person, and or even just like chairs, like how like I always think about the visual arts and how like there's like when a gallery doesn't have a chair, it tells me that they don't want me to look for very long, and they want me to keep it moving. But I know as like a visual artist that like one of the biggest complaints with like audiences is how little they spend at looking at art.
Yeah.
And
After paying whatever price they paid to get in.
Yeah.
Exactly.
But it's also just like about like subtly encouraging a particular kind of viewer.
Yeah.
A while ago we talked about like theaters in a similar way, like and how the space is and like, you know, so, you know, we're talking like about like, you know, our program where we're like, we are trying to work with these arts organizations and making sure that like we're trying to create a program that lowers the price for admissions for people. And I think, you know, a funny thing too is that like and we were getting at the kind of I don't know, cycle of inaccessibility, and I think I need to create a diagram of like there's a lack of like a particular accommodation. It's not funded because no one uses it. No one uses it because it's poor. Like the service itself is poor.
Yes.
And it's, you know, the snake, the Ouroboros snake. that
Yeah.
eats
It's eating itself.
Yes.
It's definitely a circular logic that is actually so extremely common in spaces for disabled individuals. And so I think, you know, it's been a lot of this discussion is that like you know, that I think self-diagnosis is a lot about like trying to get out of that like that cycle of like, oh, I need this, so I have to do this, and I have to do this, but I need this first, and like how does one like engage in there and I don't, I'm not saying that like self-realization works outside of that system, because of course it has to work within that system. But rather that like for some people it's been, you know, a productive path forward, and what we can do institutionally is say our job is not to police, it's not to force biocertification, it's not to become another apparatus in which you have to like come and give us a doctor's note that says that you have X thing, which means that you have to do an astronomical amount of work to get something that is honestly not as like concrete and magical as one might expect. As again, as someone who has spent a lot of time in the medical space, like it's not cut and dry. It's not, diagnosis is not this process where like check and X a lot of the time. And so
I'm going on 2 years still rocking with gotta get more tests done. You know, like
we paint such a pretty picture of go to doctor has answers, and it's like go to doctor, get test,
go to doctor, shrug.
Get test.
Interesting.
go to doctor.
Doctor says
ask doctor question second time. Ask doctor question third time.
Right.
Doctor doubts you.
Then doctor asks you the question, and you go, yes.
Doctor gives answer new from first meeting, but did not tell you. But yeah, I think we're at a good ending point. Really appreciate this conversation. It's really great. Hope that listeners, readers, tune in once again. This has been Artist Tool. Thank you so much. Bye. The music for this podcast was written and performed by Carl Trunk from Pop 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 Records. You can check out this song, It's a Creepy Stormy Day, and others from Pop 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 Records on Bandcamp.